In 1989, the land beneath a single royal garden in Tokyo was worth more than every piece of real estate in the entire state of California. Not a skyscraper, not a city block, a garden. Japan at that moment was not just the second largest economy on earth, it was on a trajectory to become the first. 8 of the world's 10 most valuable companies were Japanese. The Nikkei had doubled in 3 years. Goldman Sachs analysts were openly predicting that Japan would surpass the United States by the year 2000. And then, in a single year, it all collapsed. What happened next is one of the most studied economic stories in history and one of the most misunderstood. Japan did not just have a recession, it entered 30 years of near zero growth, deflation, and demographic decline that economists now call the lost decades. And the question that matters today is not just what happened to Japan, it is whether the same invisible trap is already closing around the United States, China, or the economy where you keep your savings. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how the trap works and whether anyone is escaping it. To understand the fall, you have to understand the rise. Between 1950 and 1990, Japan pulled off one of the most extraordinary economic transformations in human history. A country bombed to rubble in 1945 became the world's second largest economy in less than 4 decades. GDP grew at an average of 10% per year through the 1960s. Toyota, Sony, Panasonic, and Honda didn't just build products, they redefined what global manufacturing looked like. By 1980, Japan was producing more cars than the United States. By 1985, it was the world's largest creditor nation. But success planted the seeds of the crisis. In 1985, the United States pressured Japan, France, Germany, and the UK to sign what became known as the Plaza Accord, an agreement to deliberately weaken the US dollar and strengthen the yen. The idea was to make Japanese exports more expensive and reduce America's trade deficit. The yen appreciated 50% against the dollar in just 2 years. Japanese exporters were suddenly getting crushed. So the Bank of Japan responded by slashing interest rates to just 2.5%, flooding the economy with cheap money. And cheap money, when no one is watching, finds its way into speculation. What followed was a frenzy that defied all logic. Between 1985 and 1989, Japanese stock prices tripled. Urban land prices in Tokyo rose 300% in a single decade. Companies borrowed money not to invest in factories or research, but to play the stock market, a practice so widespread it had its own name, Zytec or financial engineering. NTT, Japan's phone company, became the most valuable company in the world at $300 billion, more than the entire stock market of West Germany. Ordinary Japanese workers were taking out 30-year mortgages with the expectation that prices would keep rising forever. And then the Bank of Japan did what every central bank eventually has to do when a bubble gets out of control. It raised interest rates. Starting in May 1989, it hiked from 2.5% to 6% by August 1990. That was enough. Real estate prices began a collapse that would last over a decade. The land under the Imperial Palace, once worth more than California, lost 80% of its value. And what had been built over 4 decades began to unravel, not quickly, not dramatically, but slowly, relentlessly, over 30 years. When the bubble burst, Japanese banks were left with mountains of bad loans, loans made to companies and individuals who could no longer repay them as asset values collapsed. In any functioning market, those banks should have been forced to admit their losses, write down the bad debt, and restructure. Some should have failed. Instead, the Japanese government chose a different path. Keep the banks alive artificially. They called it forbearance. Economists call it creating zombie banks, institutions technically alive but too sick to actually lend money to productive new businesses. For most of the 1990s, Japanese banks were walking corpses that kept the entire economy in suspended animation. The second trap was deflation, and it was far more insidious than inflation. When prices fall, a strange psychology takes hold. Why buy a car today if it will be cheaper next month? Why invest in a factory today if the output will be worth less tomorrow? Consumers wait, companies cut wages, investment collapses. Japan's consumer prices fell for 14 consecutive years between 1999 and 2012. Real wages fell 11% between 1995 and 2025, and Japan's nominal GDP in 2024 at $4 trillion was still below its level in 1995. A country managed to be worth less in nominal terms 30 years later than it was before. But the third trap may be the most dangerous of all, because it cannot be fixed by any central bank, any stimulus package, or any interest rate decision. Japan is running out of people. The working age population peaked at 87.3 million in 1995 and fell to 74.5 million by 2024, a decline of 14.7% in less than 3 decades. Japan's total fertility rate has been below the replacement level of 2.1 since 1974. Today it sits at just 1.2. The country loses approximately 300,000 people per year on net, and an economy that loses workers loses growth potential in the most fundamental way possible. Now combine all three: zombie banks that cannot lend, consumers who refuse to spend because prices keep falling, and a workforce that physically shrinks every single year. Each trap reinforces the others. Less lending means less investment. Less investment means less productivity. Less productivity means lower wages. Lower wages mean less spending. Less spending means prices fall further. And a shrinking population means fewer workers, fewer taxpayers, and a pension system that mathematically cannot sustain itself. Japan did not fall into one trap, it fell into three simultaneously, and it has been climbing out ever since. Japan did not sit still. Between 1992 and 1999, the government launched 10 separate fiscal stimulus packages totaling over 100 trillion yen. It built bridges, highways, and tunnels across the country, many of them in rural areas with almost no economic purpose. Japan became famous for roads to nowhere and seawalls in front of beaches with no waves. The infrastructure spent was enormous. The GDP impact was nearly invisible. Each stimulus would create a brief bounce, the government would declare recovery, cut spending, and the economy would sink again. Economists call this stop-go policy. Japan did it repeatedly for a decade. By 1999, the Bank of Japan had already cut interest rates to zero. Think about what that means. 0% interest rates are supposed to be the nuclear option of monetary policy, the last resort to stimulate borrowing and spending. Japan got there in 1999 and stayed there. By 2001, it had launched quantitative easing, buying its own government bonds to inject money directly into the financial system. Economists call what happens next a liquidity trap. You can flood the economy with money, but if banks won't lend and consumers won't borrow, the money just sits there. Japan proved the liquidity trap was not theoretical, it was real. Then, in 2012, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe launched the most ambitious economic experiment Japan had attempted in decades, what became known as Abenomics. Three arrows: massive fiscal stimulus, aggressive monetary easing, and structural reforms to make the economy more competitive. The Bank of Japan under Governor Kuroda pushed rates into negative territory and began buying not just government bonds but stocks and ETFs directly. It worked. Partially, the yen weakened, exports recovered, and the stock market roared. By 2024, the Nikkei finally reclaimed its 1989 peak, 35 years later. But wages remained stubbornly low. Deflation only fully broke in 2022 to 2023 under the pressure of global inflation rather than domestic policy. Now let me push back on the conventional narrative, because the story of Japan's failure is more nuanced than it first appears. On a per capita basis, Japan's performance was actually not that bad. Between 2000 and 2013, cumulative per capita real GDP grew 10% in Japan, compared to 12% in the United States. Not a disaster. Japanese unemployment never surpassed 5.5% even at the worst moments, compared to 10% in the US during the 2008 crisis. Life expectancy kept rising, crime fell to almost nothing, Japanese infrastructure remained world-class, the country was stagnant but not collapsing. But here is where the critique holds firmly. Japan's share of global nominal GDP collapsed from 17.8% in 1995 to just 3.6% in 2025. India has now overtaken Japan to become the world's fourth largest economy. A generation of young Japanese workers entered the workforce in the 1990s into an economy that simply had no room for them. The decade of irregular employment, insecure contracts, and the hikikomori phenomenon of young people withdrawing entirely from society. The human cost of stagnation is not always measured in GDP. Sometimes it is measured in isolation, lost ambition, and a generation that stopped believing the future would be better than the past. Japan's story is not just history, it is a warning system, and the warning lights are flashing in China right now. China's real estate sector, which drove roughly 30% of its GDP, has entered a prolonged crisis. Evergrande collapsed. Dozens of developers followed. Chinese consumer confidence has fallen for consecutive quarters. Youth unemployment hit 21% in 2023 before the government simply stopped publishing the data. China's total fertility rate is now 1.09, lower than Japan's at its worst. And China is aging faster than any major economy in history, at a pace economists call getting old before getting rich. And what about the United States? The parallels are uncomfortable but real. US government debt has reached $36 trillion, growing $7 billion per day. The Federal Reserve held rates near zero for over a decade after 2008. The same playbook Japan used. American commercial real estate is under significant stress post-pandemic, and demographic pressure is building. The US total fertility rate fell to 1.6 in 2023, below replacement for the first time in generations. America has immigration as a demographic buffer that Japan and China lack, but the structural questions are the same. Can any modern economy escape the trap Japan built? The countries that are not falling into Japan's trap share three characteristics: young populations with fertility rates above replacement, diversified economies not dependent on a single sector, and institutional flexibility, the ability to let failed banks fail, let bad debts be written off, and let creative destruction work. India is the clearest positive example: a median age of 28, a fertility rate above replacement, and a services-driven economy that does not depend on the same asset inflation model that destroyed Japan. The lesson is not that Japan failed, the lesson is that the trap is structural, and prevention is always cheaper than the cure. So what does a 30-year lost decade mean for anyone trying to build wealth today? The Japanese stock market was the worst place on earth to invest for 3 decades, even with dividends. An investor who put money into the Nikkei in December 1989 waited until 2024 to break even. 35 years. That is not a bad trade. That is a generational financial catastrophe. The lesson is not to avoid stocks, it is to understand that asset prices disconnected from economic fundamentals always eventually reconnect, and the reconnection is brutal. Three rules emerge from Japan's experience that apply to any investor in any economy. First, geographic diversification is not optional, it is survival. An investor who held only Japanese assets lost a generation of wealth. An investor with global exposure survived. Second, demographics drive everything in the long run. Before you invest in any country, check whether it has enough young people to sustain growth. Third, watch central bank rates for too long near zero. Not because zero rates are bad, but because they signal that the natural healing process of the economy has been suppressed. That suppression has a cost. Japan paid it for 30 years. Japan's lost decades are not a story about Japan. They are a story about what happens when any economy, no matter how powerful, no matter how innovative, no matter how disciplined, lets a bubble grow too large, protects the wrong institutions when it bursts, and ignores its demographic future for too long. The trap has no nationality, it follows the math. And right now, the math is pointing at more than one country. If this changed how you see the global economy, you know what to do. Subscribe to the Mainnet Codex, and I will see you in the next one.